Hi, students of Paul. Welcome to this class and to the preparation for our class with this online resource, this asynchronous resource, the title of which is Perspectives and Approaches to Paul, and subtitled The Issue of Hermeneutics. It's especially important to deal with this right now in preparation for this, for all of the rest of the work that we do with Paul. Because the question of hermeneutics, the question of perspective, is in fact the question that underlines how we deal with everything else, how we deal with texts, how we deal with interpretation, how we deal with learning, in fact. And so this is really foundational for the rest of the course and the rest of the class, and not just in Paul, but I would encourage you to take some of what we talk about here, if you don't already, and take it into other classes that you might be taking, and also to the issues of how we take in information overall. So I don't want to be on top of Paul's picture. I'm going to move myself down here. Why our perspective on Paul is important to examine first. That is, before we look at texts, before we look at anything else, let's talk about presuppositions. Why is it important? Over history, people have variously argued that Paul's letters tell us what to think about the roles of women and men, and by extension, the family, but we'll talk about that. Slavery. Paul's letter to Philemon or Philemon has been used historically to argue for slavery and to argue against slavery. Homosexuality and sexual behavior in general. Paul's letters are used, Romans especially, to talk about homosexuality, but also sexual behavior overall, sexual ethics, that is, overall. Paul's letters have been used incredibly often to talk about the so-called, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, the validity of Judaism, as if such a question is even worth asking. And with it, the so-called true nature of Christianity. These are two parts of one coin, really. Throughout Christian history, Paul's letters have been used to talk about the ongoing covenant, or lack of, covenant of the God of Israel with the Jewish people. And this is something called supersessionism. But in any case, so in other words, why is it important for us to examine our background, if any, with Paul, or our presuppositions to Paul? Because this is an issue which has been going on for centuries and centuries, the presupposition that Paul tells us something about this. Number 5, how to interact with those inside or outside of churches. Was Paul a sectarian? That is, did he say, everyone within this little group is good, everyone outside is bad, or was he more of a universalist? Number 6, Paul's letters have been used to talk about family life, including the place of children, family gender roles, right down to things like dress and hairstyles. All of these things have been appealed to by talking about Paul's letters. The government, the role of Christians, especially, I guess, in relationship to government, has been taken from, say, Romans chapter 12. So the conclusion is, whether or not one is actually a Christian, these uses of the letters have conditioned our culture and our ideas in ways that are both obvious and less than obvious. And so this is why it's important for us to take a look at our perspective on Paul before we begin actually examining Paul. Examining our and our culture's reception of Paul. So this is part of what's called reception history. How has Paul been received over the centuries, millennia really now? Because people from Christian majority cultures have gone virtually everywhere else on the planet with otherwise good or ill intentions. And because of the global impact of Christian influenced cultures via imperialism and globalism, it is inadvisable to ignore the impact of biblical and especially Pauline reception and understanding as transmitted. We do not live in a Christian world, but we certainly live in a world that has been influenced by European Christianity, especially European background Christianity. Paul's letters, as they've been understood and misunderstood, or understood variously, maybe is a better way of putting it, the understanding of Paul's letters has changed many times over the centuries. Paul's letters have affected and continue to affect real life people in real life situations. And again, I'll just appeal to the example of slavery, not contemporary, but more recent slavery up to the American Civil War and the movements for the emancipation of slavery in other places. Many Christians appealed to Paul's letters to support the institution of slavery, and many Christians appealed to Paul's letters in support of abolishing the institution of slavery in the Americas especially, but also in Great Britain and elsewhere. So that's how important and how recent. And even more recently, many churches, their stands on gay rights, gay ministers, all kinds of things, same-sex relationships, often appeal to Paul. So perspective is everything. Here, I just keep impinging on Paul. I'm going to keep moving myself around. It is important to recognize how one's starting point or perspective, that is your starting point, your family's perhaps, and that doesn't have to mean that your families, that you agree with your families. Perhaps it's in opposition to your families. The professors of particular traditions or that of various preachers or authors affects how one sees Paul's letters. In other words, who has mentored, if anyone, has mentored you, who has mentored you in terms of seeing Paul's letters. In biblical studies, this is sometimes called your hermeneutic, or your usual way of viewing or reading a text. Hermeneutics technically applies to texts, to written texts. But in fact, we tend to have a hermeneutic or a usual way of interpretation that applies to all kinds of things, visual texts, movies, Netflix or Amazon Prime series. How we view things and how we interpret them often comes from sometimes a fairly unconscious set of assumptions that we need to try and unpack in order to be able to look at things and learn new materials in new ways. Always look for the hidden default. This is one of the first rules of exegesis. That is, exegesis means taking meaning out of a text, but of identifying our presuppositions is always look for the hidden default. So while trying to understand a text, always keep an eye out for the default perspective. And the default perspective means the one that's not mentioned, that's sort of assumed. It will reveal what assumptions are operative even before one begins to try to understand a text. So what I'd like you to do now is this little exercise. I'd like you to take a couple of minutes. You can freeze or pause the video and take a few minutes and find as many default perspectives as you can in the following three statements, the ones that are listed there on the right of your screen. Take a minute, find as many default perspectives. In other words, what perspective is this statement being made from? And just list those, and we'll talk about those when we come together for discussion. And so just pause this, and then when you're done, go on to the next slide. Thank you. So here is another exercise. Now that you've finished one, here comes another. Study yourself first, your typical perspective. What I'd like you to do is take 5 minutes or so. Now, again, pause the video and take down for 5 minutes, write down also for later discussion, why you want to study Paul. And that's okay if it's just because this class happened to fit the schedule for you. That's fine. I mean, it might be something as banal as that, or it might be that that your family raised you with a certain viewpoint and now you really want to study it. It could be very profound, or it could be quite simple. Either way, whatever it is, why do you want to study Paul? And then 4 or 5 impressions that you already have of him. And if that means, if one of those is, I don't know anything about Paul, that's fine too. Just write that down. Or if you do know Paul, there's a great book that I recommend to you called Jesus Have I Always Loved, or Jesus I Have Always Loved, but Paul, ? That's the title. Jesus Have I Always Loved, or Jesus I Have Always Loved, but Paul, ? And it talks about, that's certainly about presuppositions of Paul. And then we'll talk about these when we get together. So again, pause the video and we'll talk. Next slide. All right. What is the combination of ways that you, A, already come to scriptural texts, B, would like to learn to look at scriptural texts, C, think you might learn something new from texts while using? And again, we're applying this specifically in this class to Paul and to scriptural texts in the Christian Testament written by Paul or with Paul's name attached to them. But these questions that we're about to ask in this slide, in fact, apply to many different things. They can apply to the Tanakh, to the Jewish scriptures. They can apply to other scriptures from other faiths. They can even apply to literature. Well, they certainly apply to literature. So if you're reading Wuthering Heights, or if you're watching The Good Place on Netflix. You can still say, how do you already come? How would you like to learn how to come? And what do you think you might learn from new ways? These are about perspectives of how we consume or read or imbibe all kinds of things, including in this case, scriptural texts. So let's take a look at them. Now, another of the first things I want to say is that this is not a comprehensive list, firstly, and neither is it hermetically sealed, meaning that each one of these approaches is not necessarily completely separate from another. But I've tried to provide a number of different ways that we can look at texts or read or watch movies or read Paul. But I haven't got them all, I'm sure of that. So please excuse any that I've missed, and let's take a look at them. So you can look at, and also take a look and see if there's a hidden one here too. So we can take a look at texts, at scriptural texts, Paul's texts, for instance, from Black, womanist, or Indigenous perspectives, among others. I mean, it could be a Korean perspective. It could be a settler perspective, Black, womanist, Indigenous perspectives. And if you don't know what womanist is, just take a minute and look it up, and then come back to the discussion. Traditional white or colonial perspectives. And the reason that I inserted that, and even the word white, is that I did not want white or colonialist to be the default, like to list everything else. So why, for instance, in a university, is there a women's study program? Well, what's the hidden default? Male. If there's a women's studies program and not a men's studies program, then it assumes that women's studies is a niche and that men's studies just is everything else. Here, I've included white or colonial perspectives for that reason. Jewish perspectives. I've included that specifically as its own category because the scriptures that we're talking about in almost all cases were written by Jewish followers of the God of Israel. And now, Jewish in the first century was not necessarily the same as Jewish is now, just the same as Roman in the first century wasn't the same as Roman is now. But still, I think it's worth saying there should be, or that you can look at it from a Jewish perspective. And by the way, many of the best New Testament scholars right now are Jewish scholars of Paul's writings. You can look at texts from naive or fundamentalist perspectives. Something like, this text fell down from heaven from God, and every word of it is inspired in its English translation or French translation or whatever it might be. That would be a naive perspective, unaware of historical development, for instance. You can look at a text from an environmentalist perspective. What does this have to say about creation, about the world? Well, the term creation, of course, is already an influenced term. But from what does it say about the environment, about the natural world? You can look at a text from a feminist or masculinist or gender perspectives. What does this text say about gender? You can look at a text from a decolonizing perspective, and you'll often see this referred to as post-colonial perspectives. I try to avoid the term post-colonial because I don't think that we are past colonialism, and a lot of scholars feel the same. So decolonizing perspectives, what's a way of looking at it from a decolonizing perspective? How can we can look at a text from a historical or literary perspective? These are two different things. So you can look at something from a historical perspective, quite apart from any kind of a faith thing. What's the history? So for instance, the question, did Jesus exist historically? Did the person Jesus exist historically is a historical question. Whereas the question, was Jesus raised on the third day on Easter, is a theological question. And these are two different perspectives. Now, they can overlap, but they are two different perspectives. Literary perspectives are, again, something else. You can look at a text and say, in the book of Revelation, for instance, in the Christian Testament, and point out ways in which there are intertextual references between the book of Revelation and the first book in the Bible, the book of Genesis. So many allusions between the two, and references from Revelation to Genesis. That is a literary perspective, one of many possible ways of looking at it. You can look at a text from a marginalized, disability, or queer perspectives. And here, queer means marginalized or outside the norm. And we'll be talking later about resources on all of these, but you can look at it that way. What does the text say about abilities, disabilities, or other abilitied things? What does it say about marginalized people? What does it say in terms of upsetting upsetting normative ways of looking at something and seeing it from another perspective? You can look at a text from a visual perspective, even if it's a written text. So for instance, in terms of Paul, when Paul talks about the emperor, if we think about visually what's going on in a Roman Empire where there were statues everywhere, and those statues were in some ways like billboards, which were carried messages and were all around in the cities in which Paul conducted his business and traveled. So that's a visual perspective, but only one possible way of doing it. Spatial, architectural, geographic perspectives. What does it mean that Paul's letters were primarily around what is modern day Turkey and modern day Greece? And what does that mean that it's not the same as Israel-Palestine, that it's several thousand miles away? Anyway, that's one thing. Geographically, another thing, what is the geography of what's going on in architecture? You can look at a text from economic or socio-market, or what has always or often been called Marxist perspective. That is, what are the economics going on here? What are the transactions? Is there money going on? One of the things that has been underplayed for centuries is that Paul was collecting money for Jerusalem. Now, where in Jerusalem is a little bit of a trick question, but he was collecting money for Jerusalem as he traveled around. And when he took his final trip to Jerusalem as a pilgrim, he brought money with him and delegates from the non-Jewish Jesus assemblies around the Aegean. So there's definitely something going on with money there. And that's interesting. Quite often we forget the money to our peril, so to speak, because it's actually that tells us some of our true motivations in some cases. And so it's certainly worthwhile looking at it in terms of the literature as well, and the scriptural texts. We can look at the texts from other liberationist perspectives, Latin American liberation theology and other liberation theologies. And there are many other ways that we can look at a text. I'm sure I have omitted some important ones that you might be able to provide. But why is this important? Again, to come back to what is the combination of ways you already come to scriptural texts? Maybe you do have an economic way of looking at it, or maybe you have a historical way of looking. What would you like to learn? How would you like to learn to look at Paul's texts in a different way, from a different perspective? And what do you think you might learn that's new from looking at the text from using a different perspective? It was a long time on this slide, but I think it's an important one. And again, it applies not just to Paul. Why it's important to read, cite, and learn from people other than oneself. So here again, what I'd like you to do is listen to this 10-minute podcast about Janet Stevens. Janet Stevens is a bit of a star in some ways in ancient Mediterranean historical studies, and how she came to be published in the Harvard Archaeological Review, among other places, on the subject of the ancient Romans. So listen to this podcast, it's quite short, and then answer these 4 questions on the right. And they're right there. I won't say them again, you can read them. So pause the video, listen to the podcast, and answer those 4 questions on the right. Keep a couple of notes so that we can talk about them later on, and then move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just picking up on what was said in the previous slide, this is a photo that I took in Bath in England. And the woman, you can't quite see the actor, I guess, in the middle. There are 2 people on either side. But the woman in the middle has her hair made up in a typical Roman hairstyle. And she, in fact, was doing her hair when I was there. And I was across the water from her. And I took the picture a little too late to have her doing her hair in a Roman style, but in sufficient time to have her talking to those people. So Roman hairstyles in the time of Jesus and Paul, just picking up on the previous slide and podcast. So learning from perspectives other than one's own. by reading from a different perspective as much as possible. And one of the things to do is to realize that we cannot ever get out of our own heads completely. So we never completely get away from those tricks of interpretation and understanding that come to us because of culture, background, socioeconomic status, personal history, all kinds of things. But as much as possible, if we try and make an attempt to read from a different perspective, a scholar can A, ask new questions of the text they hadn't thought of before, B, learn new things about the text in its original context, C, add significantly to the body of knowledge of that field, and D, perhaps learn new things about oneself. And this is obvious from that podcast that you just listened to about the woman who wandered into a museum on a rainy day. And the thing that she brought to a field which was dominated by people who did not resemble her. And so this is why it is important to try and look from other viewpoints, but also to listen to people who automatically look at texts from those other viewpoints. So for instance, for me, as a white male, middle-aged Christian scholar of Paul, I resemble the usual interpreter of Paul for millennia, and certainly the most usually accepted interpreters of Paul in the 20th and early 21st century. And so the kinds of insights that I'm likely to have will be conditioned by my background. And this is the viewpoint and the perspective that has been dominant for so long. And we need to hear other voices in order to learn new things. So let's talk about the next slide. To explore these questions further, I've given you a couple of resources. One is my own article called Aware Settler Biblical Studies, an attempt to try and get out of the situation of being, what does it mean to be, for instance, Canadian? In my case, European background, Canadian, second generation, on treaty territory is where I grew up, Treaty 4 territory. What does it mean to have that background and come to scriptural texts and Paul's texts? Chris Greenoff wrote a book called Queer Theologies, The Basics, Routledge 2020. And in his first chapter, chapter 1, he gives a really, really nice overview of all kinds of hermeneutics and ways of coming at texts. And it's just a really, really nice summary. And it's a small little volume, quite useful. And then Sarah Parks has written an article called The Bruton Phenomenon, Moving Women from the Margins in Second Temple and New Testament Scholarship. Now, the reason I included my own article at the front and Sarah Parks at on the third place is that these are both open access journals. That is, you can Google them and find them online. And they're certainly available also through university libraries, but you can just get them online. They're open access. And there are many, many other sources, especially remember the one I mentioned, Jesus Have I Always Loved But Paul, ? All right, that's it for today. For this particular video, and thank you for joining in, learning something about the way that we read Paul before we even read Paul. I'll see you next video. Thanks again.